So we're going to be doing a presentation, a Veterans Day presentation with Mr. Sonny Fox, all the way from Los Angeles, California. And we are here at Jupiter Middle School in Jupiter, Florida. And welcome, Mr. Fox.
We wore this when we left the service, and it's got some insignia on it, and I'm going to try to figure out whether you're going to be able to see it. First of all, can you read the stripes over here?
We can see the stripes.
Mr. Starr, can you see these?
Yes.
Okay, that means I was a sergeant. That means I was a non-commissioned officer. Commissioned officers were lieutenant up. Non-commissioned officers would be corporals, sergeants, and so on. So that was an NCO stripe. This, and can you read this? Can you see this red patch?
Not quite, a little lower, there you go.
Okay, that was my division insignia. I was in the 28th Division, and it's shaped like a keystone because it started out being the Pennsylvania National Guard. Then when the war broke out, it became a division and kept that keystone insignia, though almost nobody was left from Pennsylvania by the time I got to them. So that I was, in World War II, unlike today's wars, not just a few people were in the war, the whole country was in the war. There were more than 15 million of us in some form of military service by the time the war ended. And of course it was in Europe and it was in Asia. So we were spread out over quite a large area collectively. By being in the infantry, that meant I was carrying a rifle and moved into battle largely on foot. We had, mechanized troops, we had the Air Force, we had the Navy, we had a lot of different parts of this military activity. But I was a doughboy in World War I, they called them, but I was a GI in the trenches. Well, we're not trenches, we didn't use trenches. We used foxholes, not named after me, by the way, but they were called foxholes. These were individual holes that we dug down to kind of shield ourselves from fire. Anyway, went through basic training in Fort Benning, Georgia, then was moved off to training camps in Louisiana. And finally in September of 1943, I got on the Queen Elizabeth I, which had just been finished as a beautiful new transatlantic ocean liner in England when the war broke out. I was sitting in the Firth of Clyde in Scotland, and the British were very concerned that the Germans would bomb it, so they slipped it out and sent it to New York, where it was turned into a troop ship. And then in 1943, I got on that troop ship with 20,000 other soldiers on a ship that was built for 2,400 passengers. So every other night we could go into a cabin, and the other nights we slept on the deck. After one night in the cabin, which was built for 2 people and had 18 berths now on the wall, I chose to stay on the deck the rest of the trip. We did not sail with other ships and with destroyer escorts as slower ships did. The Normandy, the QE1, we were fast enough, they fell to elude the submarines, and they kept going on their own. So it was a 5-day trip over. I slept on the deck most of the time. We played poker, drank Coke, and passed the time. Then we were disgorged into the Firth of Clyde in Scotland, and by the way, that's a gorgeous estuary. And finally made our way down across the English Channel, across Omaha Beach, but fortunately quite a ways after the invasion. And then we were having to catch up with the war, which I did finally in a place called the Hurtgen Forest, which was not a good place to be. I knew that when we were replacements. We didn't go over as a division. We went over as just individuals to replace men who had fallen in battle, so to replace them. And that's why we were called replacements. So we were shipped across France, both by train and then by truck, until we caught up with the war. And by that time, it was pretty close to Germany. but they had paused there. They had to resupply. Patton had to resupply, get gasoline and fuel and food and so on, ammunition for the next push. So we caught up. But the Hurtgen Forest was sort of in Germany or in Belgium, and it was not a good place to be because the Germans were firing off artillery shells at tree level, designed to explode at tree level, which meant that the metal from the explosion was dispersed over a huge area. It didn't just land and affect a small area. And the result is the 28th, which had been in there for a long time, from the landings all the way across, was decimated. I knew how decimated it was when they organized us to go up and be the replacements in the Hurtgen Forest. And I looked around and there were about 100 of us going into one area. Now a company is about 240 men. So if we were going up as 100, that meant they had almost 50% casualties already. And then walking up the road to where we were going, coming down on the other side were guys with bandages in their heads and yelling about the 88s, the German artillery. And so that was an interesting introduction into my first battles, is to have the guys coming down with the bandages on their heads, yelling about how the Panzers and the 88s. It was a preface to going into battle. Anyway, we went up there, and I was let me backtrack. They lined us up into 3 squads of 12 men. 12 men were a squad, 3 squads were a platoon. And I looked around and I thought, if we're 36 men going up as a platoon, we are replacing a lot of men. And I was standing in the front of my row of 12, and they said, who wants to volunteer to be a squad leader? We had learned one thing in the Army by then: you do not volunteer for anything. So nobody raised his hand. And they said, okay, by experience, starting with me in the front, I had been in the Army 11 months. I said, well, that ain't gonna hack it. That's fine with me. And they went down, and then I had the most experience. Hence, at that moment, I became a temporary acting sergeant, and I now was responsible for 11 other young men behind me. That was a rather unexpected immediate promotion and a big load of responsibility, of course. Off we went by foot up the hill, and there was somebody from the 4th Division whom we were replacing. I'm sorry. From the 4th Division, 28th was replacing the 4th. And he showed us where we were, which were slit trenches with ice water on the bottom, snow around us. And he said, here you are, and he left. He didn't even tell me where the Germans were, but I could figure out where the slit trench was facing. That's probably toward the Germans. When I went into my slit trench, there was a frozen body of an American soldier who had been killed, and they hadn't even gotten him out. So I had to remove him first before I occupied. And I hadn't even been in battle yet, and I was facing what war looked like. It was cold and wet in that slit trench, and we all got frostbite on our feet because of that. But I had to sleep in that soggy, wet thing every night for as long as we stayed up there. We stayed up there for 2 or 3 more weeks, no fires and no comfort, and in that icy water every night, until it was time to move us out. And then we were replaced by another division. I can't remember which one it was. So that was my first sense of my battle, which was a terrible place to have to enter into battle. But they were then going to take us, the 28th Division, to a quieter part of the front so that we could sort of regroup and get our breath back and reorganize. And we ended up in a town called Hosingen in Luxembourg, about a mile from the German lines. There was a high line of a road that covered that part of Germany and Luxembourg and so on. And we were occupying it very, very thinly, I must say. There were big gaps between our positions. And So we were patrolling, and it was a quiet front. There wasn't any overt battle going on with us. There was sniping. We had to go on patrol. We would throw mortar fire into them just to harass them for a while and keep them awake. But that was not a main front at this point. And I think the expectation by our Supreme Command, Eisenhower et al., was that we were going to get ready and we would take the offensive in winter or the spring, early spring, and then get into Germany and end the war. And that would be our mission. So it was pretty. I mean, we did our aggressive patrolling, and we had some interesting times. At one point, we got ambushed by Germans. And I got sort of trapped in a beet furrow because that was the only place I could think to hide. And all the rest of my men, because I had been the last one out when I took them out, and I said, everybody get out and go over to there. And I was made sure everybody was out. So I was the last one. And then the Germans came over with their automatics and saw one guy, that was me, and they all took aim. And so I flopped into the beet furrow, which is only maybe 8 inches deep, but it felt like a secure place to me. And then finally, I realized when a bullet went between my arm and my chest, and later I realized it had ripped part of my underwear, I figured this is not a good place to be. So off I went to join the others and made it. Sometimes bravery turns out to be desperation and fatigue. You just get to that point where you say, oh, the hell with it. I just got to do this, and you do it. And I suspect that's maybe a lot of what bravery is about in the war. Anyway, we survived all those little things, and the time went on. And then one morning, about 5:20 in the morning, I had some of my squad out in the foxholes, and the rest of us were sleeping. And I heard shell fire, which was a lot of shell fire and a lot of explosions. We were about 500 yards, maybe 300 yards toward the German lines ahead of where the town was. And it was going over our head directly into the town. So I got all the rest of my guys out and into place, and then we waited. And we had, by the way, no radio, no telephone, no communications at all with the town. So I had no idea what was going on. And this went on hour after hour after hour. And by about 3 in the afternoon, I heard tanks coming down the road from the town toward me, toward our position. I had no idea if they were German tanks or our tanks. Well, they turned out to be our tanks. And now they were my tanks, without any communications with the town or anything, but they sent me 2 tanks to reinforce my position. Pretty good for a kid from Brooklyn of 18 years old, 19 years old now. So I deployed my tanks, and then a ranger squad showed up and was put under my command. Now I had my squad and the ranger squad and 2 tanks. Pretty good. And while I was waiting to be appointed field marshal, I deployed them around and figured out where the fire was coming from and tried to return it, and spent a night there. The next morning I was standing with one of the tankers. His top was up. We were looking around toward the town where some of the action was going on. And I said, we were getting sniper fire. I said, I don't know where it's coming from. Why don't you machine gun down there? Maybe they're down there. So he was laying down a fusillade. In the meantime, way over on the other side of the town, maybe 800 yards away, or maybe further than that even, 2 tanks came up on the hill. And he had his field glasses on them, and I was standing near the tank, and I said, theirs or ours? He said, square fenders, theirs. And to confirm that, the turret of one of the tanks came around, facing us, and fired. Now, this is the story of the shortest tank battle in World War II. I'm standing about 15 yards away from the tank, and the shot hits the turret. If the shot hits the turret of our tank square on, we're not having this conversation. but it hit it on an angle and glanced off about 100 yards away and exploded, with which the tanker in the tank I was next to clanged his turret shut, revved up the engine, banked in the kitchen of my farmhouse, and took off. And the other tank did the same thing. And now two tanks were scurrying away from what was the shortest tank battle in World War II, one shot. And the battle was over. And our tanks, because they were outgunned, they knew it. We had 75 millimeter low trajectory. They had 90 millimeter high trajectory, 88 millimeter high trajectory. And we were outgunned and they knew it. So the most poignant moment in World War II is Sergeant Fox running after the two tanks. You know how much noise a tank makes when it revs up and goes full speed, and then you double it with two tanks? An enormous amount of sound. They were taking off, and Sergeant Fox was running after them, yelling, "Come back, come back!" That was surely the most poignant moment in World War II. So they fled, and I was still marooned out there, and still no means of talking with the captain who was commanding our company. So I finally sent one of my men back. I said, "Tell Captain Freiker that if we don't hear from him by 3 this afternoon, I'm pulling back." I didn't hear from him. We pulled back. I got all my guys out of there, I must tell you, safely, and got them back into town. We were assigned a building near the center of town. Clearly, the offensive was coming on the road from the north side. We were on the south side toward us, and we were losing ground all that night. The battle went on until the next morning when Captain Freiker sent word out. By 11 o'clock, we're all coming out with our hands raised. What had happened is the Germans had broken through the lines right north of us. A new division, the 106, had come on 6 days earlier for the first time. They had never been battle tested. And the Germans just sliced right through them. And as a result, we had held our position, but we were now about 35 miles behind German lines. Our regiment had already gone down. Division had signed off. We were really 35 miles behind the German lines with no way out. So Captain Freiker said, "We're going to come out with our hands raised at 11 o'clock, destroy you." So we burned the Jeeps and we took out the sear pins from our guns so they couldn't be used. And we did come out with our hands raised. And now I was a prisoner of war. So Erwin Fox from Brooklyn, New York, it was now a German captive. And it was this is the way my mind works. My first feeling was, wow, it's like Alice in Wonderland. I'm going to go behind the glass and see what's on the other side. I'm going to see what's behind the German line. That sense of wonder did not last very long, by the way. Anyway, 3 days, most of 3 nights, we walked with no food or water, I might say, to a railroad siding. And there were freight trains. These are freight trains that were known as 40 and 8s, either 40 men or 8 horses. That was the old 40 and 8s. I was given a shovel, and another GI next to me was given a shovel, and we were told to get on one of the box cars and shovel out the manure from whatever animals had been in there. So we did. And then we became the animals, and not 40, but 75 in each box car, with not enough room for everybody to lie down. So then we were locked into that boxcar, and for what I remember 7 days and 7 nights, others remember it maybe 5 days and 5 nights, a little vague on that. But we were locked into that boxcar with no food, no water, and a bitterly cold January or late December. And we were freight of very low variety, let's say, to the Germans. We were not especially important to get us it was more important to get the food and the weapons to their soldiers. So we were on the siding a lot of the time. And on Christmas Eve, you heard the expression, "I got bombed on Christmas Eve"? I got bombed on Christmas Eve. We sat there and the RAF decided to raid the railroad siding that night. And indeed, a few of our guys in the back of the freight train got killed that night. We could hear those bombs coming down. You can hear them going. Normally, when you're on the ground and free to move, you get somewhere in a hole or somewhere where you get some protection. You never heard so much loud praying as I did in that boxcar that night. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I'm not sure that one of those voices may not have been mine. Anyway, we survived that and finally arrived at our first prison camp. And then we began another adventure because I am Jewish and I'm in Germany. I'm in a prison camp. A number of my other soldiers are Jewish. And that became another whole set of adventures. I'm going to stop. I am now 93 years old. I'm startled to say that, but I am. And I am astonishingly well. So I'm pleased by that. And I'm pleased to be with you today. And thank you for sitting so patiently and hearing me talk. So now.